Okay, thank you, Maureen, for joining the interview. It's been great to have you. How did you initially get engaged in disaster and DRR work back in the 1980s, I presume?
Yes, it was the late 1980s. I guess, like most people, I got involved by accident. I was taken on as a research assistant and PhD student combined to work on some large-scale surveys to do with flood management in the UK. And I knew nothing really about that because I'd come from a science technology studies background, so sociology and philosophy of science and technology. But I had applied that in ecology and environmental management. So I got the research assistantship to look at the floods aspect, basically on my background in environmental management. And then I began to learn everything there was to know about floods. Mostly in the UK, somewhat in Europe, and to a lesser extent at that time elsewhere in the world. And it was a fascinating time because I'd never studied disasters, so it was a complete introduction to the world of disasters. But coming from quite a sociological and a political, or I should say politicized background, into this world of geography, actually, and hazards, very much a hazards rather than DRR, which hadn't actually been invented then as a term. The hazards focus, there was always something missing for me. So my first introduction was in this kind of questioning way of, well, yes, that's all very interesting, but there's always this question about, but what's missing? And I didn't see the kind of sociological analysis that I had come to expect in my research work. And it was very much focused on a quantitative survey style. And I learned a huge amount. I mean, it was fascinating, and that's still an important part of my background. But it became increasingly reduced over time and replaced by qualitative research, because I was always asking questions that the quantitative studies could not answer. And it showed to me the huge sensitivity, particularly of quantitative design, where if you change one word, it can shift the focus of a survey and how it's received by the respondent, very much the respondent, not a participant, but a respondent. And all of those things pushed me towards searching for other ways of exploring the topic of floods, disasters, and then in this broader societal context.
And were you feeling isolated during that period, or did you have some colleagues at other universities who also showing interest in the social dimension of disasters? I mean, I was thinking of Bradford University and other colleagues. Were you already in touch with them, or did you, because you were working at Middlesex Polytechnic, yeah, I think, and maybe they were very kind of hazard focused and technocratic, but there were a few other universities in the UK that were also discovering the social dimension of risk and disasters, no?
Yes, there were, but it kind of came later because my it was quite a pressured job, because it was working with the Environment Agency, you know, the national agency responsible for flood management in the UK. They weren't called that at the time, but and so there was a lot of pressure on the job itself, and allied to that, I was having to do a PhD, get a PhD out of it. So, but it was in fact that doing the PhD that opened up the exploration, the broader exploration, because I think if I were just a research assistant doing a project, I wouldn't have been driven so much to dig deeper and broader. So I started to look further afield. And in fact, there were other colleagues within Middlesex as well. And I guess I started to explore it methodologically because I was very interested in qualitative research. So Tom Wengraf at Middlesex University, who's a leading scholar in the field, he initiated some very loose kind of seminars where we would, those of us who were interested would gather around and discuss methodological issues. And that started to open up windows. So the methodological approach was one of those unlocking devices for thinking more broadly about this. But in doing my literature reviews, as we all do, I was really, the world started to be opened up by, for example,
Ken Hewitt's, yeah.
Ken Hewitt, Interpretations of Calamity. And that 1983 book, which I looked at in about 1988, 89, that was really something that began to speak to me. And then I started to see, well, there are other ways of exploring this topic. For all the excellence of this work and the way it was so enlightening, because it's not particularly or at all gendered. There isn't a gender analysis. And I had come into this work with a sociological sensitivity to social stratification very broadly. And what I found was a rather narrow focus. I was in sympathy with a left political analysis of situation, but I was also looking for a gendered analysis, and I wasn't getting that. So I began to look at feminist research methods. So okay. This is Shulamit Reinhardt's large compendium, and that was another one of those unlocking devices to start to think about how else I might approach it. And while feminist approaches don't negate quantitative studies, it opens up a much bigger world. And so that was really where I started to attempt to make a difference, let's say. And so I introduced some qualitative research into Flood Hazard Research Centre, which was a well-known expert centre for quantitative studies, but at that time it didn't really do qualitative. And the clients, largely people like government agencies like the Environment Agency, didn't trust qualitative work. So when I presented
it
them,
wasn't scientific enough.
exactly.
Yeah.
When I presented them with a a mini study of I don't know, 13 or so people who had been flooded, and a qualitative report on that, our project officer said, "That was really an interesting read, Maureen. Unfortunately, we can't use it, but," and that was where we were then, which seems ridiculous now, actually, but very, very many barriers against taking that kind of approach, which was definitely seen as unscientific.
And you were definitely a pioneer in bringing a gender dimension to this kind of qualitative social science work. There were not many colleagues in the UK or elsewhere that were emphasizing this openly and clearly. I mean, you probably were also one of the first female researchers in the UK in this field. I mean, as far as I know, so it must have been quite a challenge to some extent, but also probably a lot of opportunities, because there was a whole new field to discover and to connect to, no? Or
yeah, that's true. I mean, I did my first piece of gendered research, slightly under the radar, I would say, a part of a European Union funded project, whilst still at Flood Hazard Research Centre, and it was based in Scotland. And I had nothing to go on. I had, nothing. There were no models out there, and nobody else was doing it in the UK. So it was quite lonely. But I went to Scotland with my research assistant colleague, and we interviewed various people. We did some qualitative analysis of. Well, it emerged, it really was inductive and emergent in getting these stories and understanding. What was coming through was that there were particular stories that related women's experience of, in this case, flood disasters, that were not covered at all. There were no standard questions that asked about that. There's bivariate sort of sex analysis, sex male, sex female. That's not the same as doing a gendered analysis and asking the right kinds of questions. And so those kind of stories began to come through, and this was in the early 1990s. And I couldn't really get anybody interested in that. And I did struggle a lot. I tried to bring some of these kinds of ideas that because one of the one of the main planks in the interpretations of calamity is the knowledge and understanding that came from development work in developing countries, so-called third world at the time, and they were so insightful, but I had absolutely no success in trying to persuade UK emergency planners that there was anything of interest to them in that whole approach. And it was the beginning of this changing this dominant top-down command and control paradigm to a bottom-up community-based approach. And the UK emergency planners weren't ready for that. And it was a totally masculine dominated field. And I could often be the only woman in the room. So I had to look elsewhere.
were you involved in the UK IDNDR committee, or were you invited to that? No. So it was a purely male undertaking, I think. No,
I wasn't really part of that network then, because I wasn't doing a lot of international work. It was very focused on the UK at the time. And in fact, you know, I don't have my book here because it's in my London office, but At Risk. So the first edition of At Risk in 1994, that was another one of those unlocking devices for me. Tiny bit of gender in it, but certainly a sympathetic, politically sympathetic to my way of thinking, and just unpacking this whole notion of the natural. And I'd already unlocked that aspect in terms of environmental management, you know, talking about the natural environment, natural landscapes. And we know that, you know, they've been hugely changed, even the ones that look natural, hugely changed by human beings. So I was very open to the kinds of arguments that were in that book. So the pieces started to come together, and it started to push me beyond UK borders to find what I was looking for. And I was connected with the Natural Hazard Center in Boulder, Colorado. And I emailed Mary Fran Myers, who was at that time, the deputy director of the Natural Hazard Center, and said, look, Mary Fran, I'm really trying to find out who's doing anything on gender, because I'm planning, at that time, I was planning a book on it. I was planning an edited volume to explore this. And she said, oh, wow, you need to talk to Elaine Enniston, and Betty Hearn-Morrow. That's a typical Mary Fran connection, you know. So I got in touch with Elaine and Betty, and they were like one step ahead of me. They already had an agreed book proposal. And so they said, well, why don't you write a chapter in our book? So that's how we all got together. And then from that base, we decided, you know, I went to I went to the Natural Hazards workshop in '91. And at that time, you had to stand up. Everyone stood up, said who they were, and they said, you know, what are you here for? What do you want to get out of this meeting? And I said, I stood up and said, I want to make women visible in disasters. And I want to start a website to connect people. And so Mary Fran engineered a very early morning meeting for interested people. And you had to be interested because it was 7:30 in the morning. So that, you know, sorted the sheep from the goats. So do you want to get together and talk about this? So at that point, we launched what came to be the Gender and Disaster Network. And that actually had moved on. So the launching of that, all of that took place in 1997 in the end. So it was a long process, actually.
Yeah, it took like 6 years between the first ideas and then setting it up. And what was your role in the Gender and Disaster Network? Was it a very structured initiative, or was it a loose network, or
very loose? Yeah, very loose. We just sat round in a room, said, what should we do? Well, I think, you know, let's start up a kind of a list, an email list. We need a website. I was very interested in websites at that time. I was making my own websites, very simple ones, and actually teaching students to do it. And Nikki Nikki Dash at that time Florida International University, she had kind of institutional access. So she set up the initial Gender and Disaster Network. And it, to be honest, it didn't really go anywhere for a year or two. And other people, you know, had other commitments on their time, and it's always been voluntary, you know. So
But you were not very active in the UN processes at that time, trying to influence some states like IDNDR or so. I mean, because this has changed definitely in the last 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
very
at that
much.
time it was not focused so much on UN global processes yet, though.
No, well, you know, it was IDNDR, you know, it was the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. And, you know, it was still very much in that mindset. And it didn't really have space for this. And I was still working in very much in a kind of scholarly mode, actually, thinking more about the research and the theoretical aspects. And that stopped being enough after I had my first discussions with people I was interviewing, and realized that there were very real implications, lived experience implications of not understanding disasters properly and not understanding the way they affected different social groups in different ways. Because there was the kind of command and control model and a very sort of universal single approach to the victim and the problem was too much of a blunt instrument. You know, it just was not, it was not helping some people at all. So that made me, that turned me much more into an activist and an advocacy person, and working in a much more applied way. So it was that kind of gradual process, and just trying to make things happen on the ground for people, on the basis of their expressed experiences, which were not coming through in, or were seen as tangential, or seen as not within our mandate for emergency planners, say, and this is classic, you know, siloed activities, not within our mandate, not something we deal with in emergencies and disasters, tyranny of the urgent, you know, focus on saving lives, all of that. It pushed me towards other kind of audiences and platforms. But then the Gender and Disaster Network, it was unique. It was the first of its kind. And it was the only place, those of us who had any interest in this gender plus disaster nexus, had somewhere to go to and to discuss and to share ideas and experience, and just have other people who were coming from a vaguely similar background.
And when did people from developing countries or activists in this field join the network? Because I mean, your first contacts were definitely with US academics, but now the network is far bigger and it has a strong southern dimension as well. So when did that happen, that you or the colleagues managed to reach out to people in the South who are directly dealing with these vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think it happened very soon afterwards, actually, because it very quickly had a large, particularly South Asian membership, for obvious reasons. You know, there are so many disasters in South Asia, but there's also so much innovative disaster management in South Asia as well. And because of the disaster development linkages, there were a lot of gender scholars and gender practitioners who had been working in development who couldn't avoid disasters, but nobody had really separated the two at that time. So, I mean, there is a separate gender and development network, but this was the gender and disaster network, and we drew very much on people with that development experience, you know, much as came out of the Ken Hewitt's Interpretations of Calamity edited volume. So disasters has always had this kind of catching up approach really to development. Development ideas tended to be about 10 years ahead of disasters catching up with it. So we could draw on the insights from gender and development and bring that into gender and disaster. And because it was the only platform out there, and because it had a website where we could put stuff, you know, it became a repository, a way of connecting, but also a repository that people could go to. And so it kind of blossomed from there, really.
And who were some key people from South Asia or Southeast Asia that you worked with at the time who were kind of activist gender people at that time?
To be honest, I can't separate out any particular names. I mean, someone who's I'm still in contact with is Mahbooba Nazreen in Bangladesh, and Shaman Pincher, who did the first piece of work really that looked beyond the binary, beyond women, beyond gender as a simple binary, male, female, masculine, feminine. And there were just so many different people, and they came from academia, they came from the UN system, they came from students, they came from, it's still the same kind of makeup actually, NGOs and others. Yeah, there's a 1,000 members of, you know, GDN, and the amount of posting of messages of each individual is is small, you know. So across the board, it's pretty varied.
And I mean, what I associate you with is also with RADIX and the work that you did with Ben and other colleagues. How did that come about? I'm not sure about the date of creation. It's probably past 2000, but still an interesting initiative, but I think hard to keep alive, or at least hard to get people involved. But how did that kind of come about, and what was its purpose?
Yeah. 2001 actually, but you know, only just so into January, February 2001. So there was the Gujarat earthquake in January 2001, and following that in February there were the two earthquakes in El Salvador. And so it was a very bad start to 2001. And Ben emailed me and said, isn't it terrible what's happening in El Salvador? I'm thinking of writing a paper. Do you want to join me in writing a paper? And I said, oh, Ben, you know, I am so busy at the moment. I can't think of writing a paper. But I tell you what, why don't we start something? Why don't we start a website? Because I was very into websites, you know, and why don't we start a website where we can start to bring together some of these questions and these ideas about the appalling things that are happening in terms of land management and creation of risk that impacting so many marginalized, particularly marginalized groups who are dying in these earthquakes and the subsequent landslides, etc. So I set up the RADIX website as, again, a repository, a location where we could put some of these things. And Ben would start with these think pieces. And then people would send in some ideas, or they'd say, well, have you read this? And so we'd put a link to that. It just grew like that. So of course, from saying, Ben, I haven't got time to write a paper, the next 6 weeks was totally consumed with setting up RADIX. And again, it's just a very loose network of interested people, all done voluntarily. So now voluntarily, there's the Gender and Disaster Network and there's RADIX. And other things besides. And we never had any money for anything, you know, so we never could pay for anyone to do anything, except for a brief amount of time. We had some money on the Gender and Disaster Network, and I could employ Christine Sands. And she became, you know, my co-conspirator on the Gender and Disaster Network, and allowed us to develop and reach out more. But we've never really pursued money. And to be honest, it changes relationships once you bring finance into it. And I think Gender and Disaster Network has shown its sustainability just through commitment to the ideas over the years. So it hasn't got lots of bells and whistles, and but it serves a purpose, and it certainly brings people together and is a platform for advocacy, and quite broad-based advocacy, actually, for very different kinds of people involved in Gender and Disaster Network, as there are in RADIX as well.
So it's not part of UCL and your current function at all, or is it?
Gender and Disaster, yeah, RADIX isn't, except in terms of networks of interested people. So David Alexander and Ilan Kelman, my colleagues at UCL, because they're based in London, and Terry Cannon is based in London. So they kind of rejuvenated RADIX, but not in web terms, but just in regular discussions where people could meet face to face, because we've never done that before. It's all been virtual. So, you know, there's a series of regular meetings, or there were prior to lockdown. Gender and Disaster Network is our kind of sister center, because we now have a Gender and Disaster Research Center at UCL, part of IRDR, the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. And so they're kind of co-located, and GDN does a lot of the advocacy and policy advocacy. And the center is very much a research center.
And how does this work relate to HUAIROU Commission and other gender networks in the world that are, I mean, probably profiling themselves even more actively? Are you very closely linked, or you're working on different fronts?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah, very closely linked. I was actually an academic advisor for HUAIROU Commission for a while, and they're a group that I very greatly respect, and their for me, their particularly significant contribution in our world, if you like, is to very clearly demonstrate, you know, put their words into action in that UN DRR sense. But for example, whereas most of the people we work with, NGOs and INGOs, are speaking on behalf of marginalized groups, HUAIROU Commission brings marginalized groups to the UN system and allows them to speak for themselves. And that was a turning point, I think. And HUAIROU Commission's very politically savvy. And so they made more inroads, I would say, or maybe not more, but a very significant inroad into the way parts of the UN system were thinking about things. And just, it all happened at the same kind of time as the kind of NGO, global NGO networks were campaigning for more community representation at those kinds of events. And HUAIROU Commission would always bring a proportion. So it's not just all HUAIROU Commission people, but they would bring grassroots women leaders, for example, to the UN. And I've been, you know, I've worked closely with them for a number of years. I'm a great supporter of what they do. Also, Duryog Navaran in South Asia, sort of South Asia Disasters Net, and Ramona Miranda, for example, is someone I've worked with over the years, and she has also been there, not often in the foreground, but she's always been there in the background. She's always been there doing the work, doing the preparation, pulling together the meetings and reports, etc., for regional meetings feeding into the UN. You know, she's one of those sort of unsung people who really have moved things along in their quiet way, I would argue. So yeah, that's another group.
And then there's also the let's say the kids or children networks, which somehow also work around young girls and so on. I mean, how did that work, this collaboration? Because that's also often, I mean, children and gender are kind of lumped together, but that has different realities, but still connected to some extent. So how did those networks collaborate?
In early 2000s, I was asked to do some work for Plan International, somebody at Plan had heard me speak at an early warnings conference, actually, and wondered if I would be interested in working with them, because at that time, and this was 2004, early 2004, Plan were exploring developing their disasters policy, and they didn't have one at the time, which again seems so strange looking back, but they were, you know, they were about children's development, and they kind of protected that space as part of their distinctiveness. And yet all the time, you know, they were faced with disasters and also risk and risky environments. So I worked with Plan, helping them develop their disasters policy. Then, in the middle of all of that, was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And at that point, everybody was doing disasters. That flipped, you know, so much for so many people. And suddenly, I was still in a process of having to push Plan International, some people in Plan International, to consider taking on board disasters and having a disasters policy. As after the tsunami, I didn't have to push anymore.
No.
But I've stayed connected with them, and also did some work around gender as well with them. And I've also been involved in the Because I Am a Girl series that Plan authors, edits, and there's now quite a lot of interesting work. But it's still gender equals women, and then gender equals women and girls. And so it's the latest thing where you have to drag people along with you is to think beyond that binary.
Mm.
That's the kind of current cusp and challenge, I think, how we really move people's thinking on beyond very simplistic notions of gender, and to think much more intersectionally, even when they're thinking about women, to think what women, and break that down a lot more.